Often regarded as a military genius, Napoleon's handling of the Grande Armée during the period 1805 to 1807 certainly offers great support to this claim, but any success cannot solely be credited to him. As we have seen in the previous parts of this series, the infantry, cavalry and artillery were steps ahead of their rivals, often thanks to measures put in place prior to the revolution, and together they provided France with quite probably the best army of the age. However, no matter how deadly the weapon, it still needed honing, and perhaps there was no one more suited to this task than the emperor, nor anyone better equipped to wield it. Therefore, in the following video, we will look at how these three arms were combined upon the battlefield, the organizational systems they used, and ultimately how Napoleon was able to lead them to success. Before we begin, we must first define what we mean by grand tactics and strategy. The two terms see heavy use throughout the writings of military history, yet it is rare to find any form of consensus upon either their use or their definition. Some authors appear to use the terms interchangeably, with both meaning essentially the same thing, whereas others use them independently, yet with varying definitions. I myself have no direct answer to this question, and instead will turn to Jomini, who offers the following explanation. Strategy is the art of making war upon the map, and comprehends the whole theatre of operations. Grand tactics is the art of posting troops upon the battlefield according to the accidents of the ground, of bringing them into action, and the art of fighting upon the ground, in contradistinction to planning upon a map. Although Jomini makes clear distinctions between the terms here, any student of military history will know that each factor is intrinsically tied and dependent upon the other. What I mean by this is that the grand tactical decisions will be influenced by the strategy that got the army to the battlefield, for example the choice of ground or the timely arrival of reserves, whilst good strategical thinking will always keep in mind the tactical capabilities of the army at hand. If we take the Normandy campaign of 1944 as an example, it is known that the Allies held a material advantage over the Germans, as well as an almost complete control of the skies. These, using Jomini's definitions, would be grand tactical factors. However, it is pretty obvious that these battlefield advantages had a major influence on the strategical decision-making of the Allied High Command when studying their maps, and these strategical decisions then allowed the troops to make best use of the advantages that they held. Obviously, things are much more complicated in reality, but my point is that, with how dependent each factor is on the other, it is easy to see how and why so many historians choose to combine and interchange the two terms. However, whilst I'm not criticizing these historians for doing this, for the remainder of this video I will be using the terms separately and as defined by Jomini, which I will now repeat for clarification. Grand tactics are the methods upon which a general fights a battle. They include his order of battle, his plans of engagement, and any and all maneuvers that take place upon the battlefield. Strategy is the means by which the general chooses the ground over which to do battle, the circumstances under which two opposing forces meet, and it defines the movements of the army both before and after the engagement. Jomini also mentions that logistics is the factor that links both strategy and grand tactics together, but this will be discussed in more detail during part 5 of this series. The final point to consider before we move on to the main discussion is what exactly is the art of war. Fortunately, we can remain with Jomini, for his definition of it remains consistent regardless of whether it is being applied to grand tactics or strategy. To Jomini, the art of war is essentially the means of massing one's troops at the decisive points in a theatre while simultaneously deceiving the enemy and preventing him from doing the same. To those already well versed in the campaigns of Napoleon, it is clear to see that Jomini, when composing this definition, was heavily influenced by what he had witnessed both fighting for and against the emperor. Even when generally outnumbered, Napoleon always sought to find local advantages at the key points, both on and off the battlefield. His Italian campaign in 1796, as well as the 1814 campaign in France, are perfect examples of this principle. This does not mean that Napoleon was the inventor of the art of war, very far from it, and as we will see later in the video, he himself learned and understood these same concepts via the study of other great generals, as well as from the tactical thoughts and writings of great military minds before him. The simplicity of these definitions should also not imply that warfare itself is simple. Jomini in fact spends practically an entire book expanding upon and explaining the intricacies of this art of war to varying degrees of success. This difficulty in doing so is understandable, because as soon as one starts to consider how many different factors could possibly influence the outcomes of a campaign, it quickly becomes very complicated. A brilliant general must not only be able to identify what the key points are, he must find ways of achieving local supremacy at these points, whilst also deceiving his opponents as to their true value. But this is exactly why warfare is seen by military writers as an art form, and why the greatest commanders are referred to as geniuses, because their actions fit, at least to me, the definition of genius. That is, they possess the ability to make the complicated appear simple. Hopefully that all makes sense, and with these factors defined and the art of war understood, we can move on to the main discussion. Although on campaigns, strategy of course would come first, it will be easier if we begin with grand tactics and events upon the battlefield. The order of battle that an army forms up in has always been an important aspect in warfare, and can very often be the deciding factor in an engagement. Perhaps one of the most famous examples of this being the Battle of Ilipa in 206 BC, where Scipio led a Roman army to victory against a numerically superior Carthaginian force led by Hasdrubal. After arriving and setting up camp opposite each other, the two armies then spent several days deploying into their battle formations, only to then stand off and refuse to fight, all of which was a deception plan designed by Scipio. After several days, during which Scipio intended that Hasdrubal should become quite familiar with the order of the Roman formation, he determined on action. He had seen that Hasdrubal always placed his African troops in the centre and his allies on the wings, with elephants in front of them. He himself had been in the habit of placing his Roman troops in the centre and his Spanish allies on the wings, that is, in a formation which matched that of his opponents. On the day of the battle, however, Scipio reversed his usual formation, and by attacking the enemy camp with his light cavalry just after dawn, he forced Hasdrubal to hastily deploy his men into their usual order of battle. This allowed the superior Roman infantry to face off against the weaker allies on the flanks, a move that saw Scipio emerge triumphant. Although the battle itself involved more to it than this simple change of formation, it certainly helped to set up the victory, and the Carthaginians' inability to reverse their own order of battle before combat was joined showed how inflexible the early armies could prove to be once formed up. Although by the 17th century, black powder weapons had certainly altered unit formations and methods of engagement, in many ways grand tactics were still similar, and order of battle remained vitally important. The armies which had been used throughout the modern period down to the middle of the 18th century were single entities. They marched in a formation which was directly analogous to that in which they fought, i.e., they could take up their order of battle by a direct manoeuvre from the order of march. By the turn of the 18th century, the infantry was universally armed with firearms, and thanks to the bayonet, able to conduct both shock and fire action. Favouring fire, they primarily formed in three-ranked lines, prompting this style of battle to be called linear warfare, and although it is very often seen as static, this does not mean that it was void of any tactics. In fact, one of the early generals during this period was Marlborough, a man held in high regard in many discussions concerning military commanders. The theme that Marlborough developed at Blenheim, and on which he was to play variations through most of his major battles, featured the use of repeated strong attacks at places where he did not intend to stage his climactic assault, to draw the enemy's attention away from the eventual focus of decision, and to tempt the enemy into weakening the critical sector of his lines. This style can be seen to fit with Jomini's description of the art of war. Marlborough first identified the key point upon which he intended to strike, and he then compelled his opponent to weaken that point by staging diversionary attacks at multiple other locations. When he sensed the time was right, he would then launch his main attack, achieving local superiority at this critical juncture by using cleverly conserved reserves, which would usually then carry the day. Despite the success that Marlborough undoubtedly saw on the battlefield, he could never match it on the strategic level, though through no fault of his own. This was because even when he had strategically outmaneuvered his opponent, the long time required in forming up for battle meant that engagements would often not take place until the afternoon, and could therefore rarely be forced. On multiple occasions, and much to Marlborough's frustration, his opponents simply refused battle when the circumstances looked unfavourable, and were able to march away relatively unopposed. By the middle of the century, however, Frederick the Great began to change this outlook. Our wars must be short and lively. Being frequently outnumbered by the various coalitions facing him, Frederick was not opposed to taking a defensive stance, But, like Marlborough, his preferred mode of operations was to seize the initiative, be the aggressor, and to seek out his opponents. Whilst Marlborough may have struggled to force battle, Frederick had a distinct advantage in this area. The Prussian army, unlike most European armies before 1740, had a system of drill that was uniform throughout the army. This system, continually practiced, devoted much attention to marching in step even under combat conditions, to retain a coherent line while advancing against the enemy. The Prussians had also modified their march formations so that the files forming columns of march could more readily transform themselves into lines of battle, thus hastening the cumbersome task of deployment on which the outcome of a battle might well depend. The ability of his army to both march quickly and to then rapidly deploy for action meant that Frederick very often could now force battle onto his opponent. He would combine this advantage with a favourite grand tactic of his, the oblique order of attack. The idea here was to advance in echelon towards only one flank of the opposing army, refusing the other, and therefore engage only with one part of the enemy, a point of his choosing. This attack would be supported by cavalry and massed artillery, and with the orders of battle still rigid during the period, as well as the Prussians' speed on the battlefield, Frederick's opponents were rarely able to react to this style of warfare. Once again, Jomini's art of war can be clearly seen, and arguably the most famous example and the pinnacle of Frederick's achievements came against an Austrian and French alliance at the Battle of Rosbach in 1757. With the two armies in camp facing one another, it was the Allies who made the first move, ironically attempting to give Frederick a taste of his own medicine. Recognizing that they held the numerical advantage and that Frederick's position was potentially vulnerable, they left a diversionary force in place and began to march with the bulk of their army on a wide sweeping maneuver, the idea being to then redeploy perpendicular to the Prussian flank. Because of disagreements between Allied senior officers, as well as the time required to actually get the army into motion, this grand maneuver didn't get underway until about 11 a.m. Although initially deceived by the intentions of his opponents, thinking them retreating, once the vanguard of the flanking force was nearly in line with his left, Frederick realized the danger and immediately roused his men. The training and discipline of his soldiers would prove decisive, as his army was ready to deploy within half an hour, just a sixth of the time that it took the Allied army to do the same thing. Forming up first to the east, he then marched forward in his usual oblique order, left in front, with the aim of either smashing the vanguard of the enemy, or, if they were further ahead with their plan and actually deployed into line, he would hit their flank and roll them up. In actuality, he caught them in between both of these circumstances, which only added to the Allied confusion once battle was joined. Whilst the Prussian infantry proved its superiority, the Prussian cavalry leader von Seilitz, having defeated the enemy cavalry, turned his attention towards the fleeing Allied infantry, turning flight into a rout and securing a famous victory. Of course, Frederick wouldn't have it his own way forever, and as the wars continued, his tactics became less effective as his opponents began to recognize and devise systems by which to counter them. The Austrians formed their general staff in February 1758, and they very soon showed a greater flexibility and freedom in all of their operations. At Hochkirch, they pioneered a way of attacking by converging columns, and they went on to employ it still more successfully at Maxen, where they took an entire Prussian corps prisoner. This dividing up of both the command and the army itself was a foreshadowing of what was to come, yet Frederick, too reliant on his own genius and decision-making, refused to utilize it, though he did present some interesting ideas which he never quite put into practice. His writings after the 7 Years' War show that he intended to deny the Austrians the chance to concentrate their separate columns by means of diversionary attacks enacted by small detachments along their lines of communication. Having thus divided his opponent, Frederick would then seek to concentrate his own force upon the battlefield, whilst utilizing a mass of heavy artillery to provide the necessary firepower to give his army the edge. He attempted to enact this strategy during the War of Bavarian Succession, but his artillery moved too slow, and by this point the Austrians moved too quick for him to concentrate successfully. Nonetheless, the basis behind these ideas would become features of Napoleonic warfare. This final failure does not detract from the achievement of old Fritz, who brought the oblique order to near perfection, abandoned it as soon as it ceased to yield dividends, and in his search for new directions anticipated one at least of the salient features of the battle tactics of Napoleon. The utter humiliation at Rossbach had proven to the French that drastic change was needed, for despite initially being the attackers, the initiative had been stolen due to the superior mobility that the Prussians possessed. French generals knew, however, that this mobility came from extensive training and a discipline that their own armies simply didn't possess. To compensate for this disadvantage, the French began to multiply the number of columns in order to cut the time and distance required for deployment. This led to the establishment of the divisional system, one of the greatest landmarks in the history of warfare. Although similar to the Austrians' answer to the Frederick problem, it seems that neither they nor the French were the only ones apparently considering such changes, as towards the last quarter of the 18th century, several of the major European nations were making alterations to their army organization. Austrian, British, Prussian and Spanish generals, as well as French, were all thinking in terms of large independent detachments that could survive when separated from the main body, and it is totally misleading to suggest that monarchic principles worked against such an idea, or that a democratic revolution was necessary before it could take root. It may appear fairly trivial compared to the makeup of modern forces, but up until this point, armies were often viewed and treated as single entities, usually under the command, control and direction of one man. They were cumbersome and often had numerous supply wagons that only slowed and added to their mass. In the places that they were divided, such as by wings, divisions or brigades, these were for the most part either strictly administrative or were never permanent, which therefore dissuaded any form of cohesion and especially any chance of independent action. Interestingly as well, as Griffith points out at the end of the previous quote, this decentralization of command was taking place under the eyes of the old regime and before the rise of any revolutionary fever, which is usually given the credit for it. Although many different nations were trialling such ideas, it would be the French who would pursue them the furthest. Early origins of this mode of thinking can be found in the military musings and writings of Marshal Maurice de Saxe, and it was here where these ideas first came to the attention of French military minds. Saxe was a distinguished general, and in his book Mes Rêveries, he listed many novel ideas, including new weapons that he had designed, along with new formations and tactics, but at its core, the book laid out the foundations for the construction of his ideal army. Taking inspiration from the Romans, he intended to break his infantry down into what he termed legions. Each of these legions would contain 4 regiments, each of which would then contain 4 centuries, plus a half-century each of light infantry and light cavalry. In addition, each century would have a small caliber artillery piece, an amusette, a weapon of Saxe's own design, whilst the legion as a whole would receive 2 12-pounder cannon. As you can see, this is in essence a combined arms force, and although Saxe held a dim view of firepower, regarding it as relatively ineffective, he generally did advocate for combined arms operations on the battlefield. The light troops attached to each regiment were to work as skirmishers ahead of the infantry, whilst the cavalry would split into 2 35-man squadrons, one on each wing, and would then either pursue the enemy should the infantry prove successful in their attack, or else cover the retreat if they were not. During the War of Austrian Succession, Saxe attempted to implement elements of all of this into his campaigns, and whilst as a general he was victorious, these ideas never took root in the army, and it would be nearly a decade after his death until the same concepts would be revisited. Marshal Saxe was not only a great commander in the field, but also an original thinker in strategy, organization, and tactics. His Reveries, written about 1732, were not published until 7 years after his death. Even then, they did not receive the attention they deserved. However, they gradually permeated French military thought and laid the foundations of the doctrine which prevailed at the close of the century. As mentioned, it would take disaster at Rossbach to spark the French interchange, and prior to the outset of the campaign season in 1760, Marshal Broglie issued instructions for a new method of organizing the army. The infantry of the army was divided into 4 equal divisions, while each wing of cavalry also formed a division, and this organization was to last throughout the entire campaign. The army ordinarily marched in 6 columns as compared to the 2 or 3 of the old system. Although initially intending to be merely for the duration of the campaign, it seems to have proven popular because sometime later this divisional system was officially codified and made a permanent part of the French army. It established an infantry division at a strength of 16 battalions and 8 part guns, which was to be commanded by a lieutenant general. A marshal de camp was to command 8 battalions and 4 guns, whilst a brigadier commanded 4 battalions. A cavalry division was to be composed of 24 squadrons and 8 guns under the command of a lieutenant general and would be subdivided in the same way as an infantry division. Although not yet a combined arms force, as the cavalry and infantry remained in separate divisions, this system did offer to solve multiple problems. Firstly, it allowed the army to increase the number of roads that it used, for each column could now march independently towards the battlefield, easing logistical problems and confusing the enemy as to the eventual order of battle. Secondly, by delegating command of each division and its subsequent parts to subordinate officers, it went some way into relieving the burden of command from the commander-in-chief, who, no longer having to worry about things like marching orders or alignment, could instead focus on strategical and grand tactical matters. Finally, by creating permanent organisations, it encouraged the cooperation between the brigades and regiments that made up these divisions, and this culminated in the 1780s with the creation of 17 territorial divisions, each consisting of at least 2 brigades. The idea was that at the outbreak of war, these various divisions would become immediate combat formations and could be grouped if necessary under various senior commanders in order to form armies. This was the system which was in place for the French army prior to the events of 1789, but of course, as can probably be expected at this point, these 17 territorial divisions were immediately disbanded once the revolutionaries gained power, not because it was a bad idea, but simply because it held ties to the old regime. Thankfully, sanity soon returned, and as did the divisional system, though this time not as regional divisions, but as 23 military divisions, each with a separate headquarters in the various regions of France, clearly completely different. The revolutionary changes did bring an added benefit to this system, however, thanks to the infantry regulations established in 1791. These were discussed in more detail during part 1 of this series, but essentially they simplified considerably the various manoeuvres and thus quickened the infantry's ability to navigate between the various formations. When combined with the divisional system, these 2 factors alone greatly improved the flexibility of the army. The importance of being able to form an order of battle ahead of the line of march directly from marching columns by a short and rapid manoeuvre cannot be overestimated. It would henceforth be possible to delay deployment much longer and consequently to execute it much closer to the enemy. Once the Revolutionary Wars began in 1792, their sheer scale also forced the French to make a further alteration to the divisional system, incidentally bringing it closer to Sax's original concept, and that was to create combined arms forces, or combat divisions. Up to this point, the divisional system had kept the cavalry and the infantry separate, which while it certainly improved the mobility of the army off the field and in terms of deployment, it still tended to suggest a certain order of battle and a separation of the arms. These new combat divisions, ideally consisting of 2 infantry brigades, a cavalry squadron or regiment, and an artillery battery, now encouraged combined arms operations. This improvement further added to the independence of these divisions. It did break away from the old idea that the whole army had to maneuver together and fight as one block, since, as soon as a number of independent commands were created, especially when they each included units of all 3 arms, they could be sent out in different directions to cover as much wider frontage than hitherto. As great as this sounds, with these new combat divisions opening up a wide variety of strategical possibilities, the complexity of coordinating such manoeuvres proved difficult, as both Griffith and Quimby explain. Obviously, the art of making attacks with a series of separate columns depended on setting the right spacing and timings between them, depending on the terrain and other local circumstances, so that they are neither too far apart to give mutual assistance, nor too close together to create overcrowding. The unskilled generals of the early campaigns in the wars of the French Revolution made an altogether excessive dispersal of divisions and a rather, or even quite, uncoordinated use of them in battle. As mentioned earlier, many of the Allied nations facing France had also begun to divide their armies up into smaller parts, though often on a far less permanent basis. Fortunately for the French, however, during this early period, the Allies were likewise guilty of spreading their forces too wide. These dispersals by both sides were not always because of a lack of generalship, because once these smaller forces began to contain a mixture of arms, generals, quite naturally, now saw themselves in possession of multiple smaller, self-reliant armies, with which they could now use to hold a much larger frontage than they previously could. This then led to the cordon system, where battles became a series of almost unconnected and frequently uncoordinated conflicts between these smaller forces. This is not to suggest that the early revolutionary battles were all like this, nor that it was void of any tactical or strategic thinking, because initially it was the French who were better able to mass their forces than the Allies, often relying on weight of numbers to claim various victories. This latter point is shown by the fact that during encounters where the odds were more even, then it was usually the Allies who came out on top. The French should not be mocked in this regard though, for if we recall that the art of war is to mass more troops at the point of interest than the opponent, then this is exactly what the French were doing, and one figure who deserves a brief mention in regard to this was Lézère Carnot. Although perhaps better known as the mastermind behind the levée en masse, he was also referred to as the organizer of victory. Able to navigate the tumultuous political waters of the early revolution, Carnot managed to consistently find himself as the equivalent of Minister for War, and therefore directing the French war effort. The essential instructions are always to maneuver en masse and offensively. Although perhaps more on the strategical plane, Carnot's methods sought to negate this cordon style of warfare, consistently calling for united action and concentration of forces. During the period of the Terror, it was his leadership and direction that went a long way to ensuring success upon the battlefield, all at a time when France had lost many of her experienced generals, and the turnover of replacements could be extremely quick. On January 30th, 1794, Carnot described the way in which this new army was to be used in his General System of Operations for the next campaign, which set forth the principle of mass warfare with its need for rapid troop movements and dynamic leadership. Carnot's strategy was simple. Like Dumouriez the previous year, he proposed to mount holding operations on the Pyrenees, Alps and Rhine while striking north with a concentrated force. However, returning to the cordon system, the Allies quickly learnt from their mistakes, and by 1794–95, they were already beginning to gather their own forces just as quickly for the various operations, and numbers alone no longer proved adequate for the French. Fortunately, by this point, the French infantry had begun to prove itself, and many of the future stars of the empire had started to rise the ranks, one in particular shining brighter than the others. Before we dive into any tactical discussions regarding the future emperor, I think it first best to conclude the story of the divisional system and explain how and why Napoleon morphed it into the corps system. When given generalship of the army of Italy in 1796, Napoleon did not yet hold the power to make the grand structural changes that he later would, but along with producing rousing proclamations to raise the morale of his men, he also made a few tweaks to the existing divisional system that the army was using. If we take a look at a few sample divisions taken from the Army of the Meuse under General Moreau and the Army of Italy under General Bonaparte, both from 1796, we can immediately see that Napoleon had removed the cavalry from each division, instead forming it into its own division. This may seem like a step backwards from the combined arms flexibility which the new combat divisional system was offering, but Napoleon had his reasons for doing so. Firstly, he didn't believe that the cavalry could operate effectively at what is essentially squadron-level engagements, and when referring back to part 2 of this series, it is easy to see why he would think this. The French cavalry during the Revolutionary Wars was at best unreliable, and even at their peak during the Empire, they always performed better in larger actions, where formation, discipline and manoeuvre took precedence over the individual horsemanship, which was usually found lacking in the French rider. His second reason for removing the cavalry was that, by doing so, they would no longer get caught up in the minor engagements involving the division, and instead be free to act as a reserve, ready to be thrown into the critical point at a timing of his choosing. It simply gave him more control over the flow of the battle. Interestingly, however, if we consult the orders of battle for the two major engagements fought between Austria and France in 1800, General Moreau's Army of the Rhine at Hohenlinden looked far more like a French army from the Empire period than Napoleon's did at Marengo. Both parties were still operating in theory on the divisional system, though Napoleon had again removed the cavalry, but because of the size of Moreau's army, each division had enough infantry and cavalry to look like a corps d'armée. The only thing lacking was the number of artillery, something which Napoleon would alter when he instigated the corps system officially. This corps system of organisation was hardly novel. Moreau, Hoche and Napoleon himself had been developing it as they went along during the 1790s. It was not a new concept Napoleon plucked out of the air, and it was fully formed as a working model in his mind and those of his commanders by 1803, but the exceptional circumstances of the Channel camps enabled it to become the familiar norm for the entire army. As Broers suggests here, and as we can see from the Hohenlinden example above, the corps as a system was already developing prior to Napoleon's intervention, and once the Peace of Amiens broke down in 1803 and war once again started between Britain and France, Napoleon had a unique opportunity to bring the various ideas together and solidify them as the official French army system. With the hope of invading Britain, Napoleon set up multiple camps along the Channel coast in order to train the men who were supposed to undertake this rather ambitious task. There were 6 camps, the furthest north being at Utrecht, technically in Dutch territory, commanded by Marmont. Davout, Soult and Ney commanded camps at Bruges, Saint-Omer and Montreuil respectively, whilst Augereau was in charge at Brest. The final camp and the centre of all operations was at Boulogne, directed by Napoleon himself and where the soon-to-be Imperial Guard was based. In addition to this, Junot trained the Grenadier Division at Arras, whilst Bessières commanded the cavalry of the Guard, and Murat, as military governor of Paris, helped to oversee the training of the line cavalry. In regards to the other leaders and major characters, Bernadotte was in charge of a small force in northern Germany, whilst Lannes and Massena held positions in Italy, training the troops there. Finally, Berthier, as Minister of War, took care of the major administrative work and coordination between the camps. Each camp consisted of between 25 to 30,000 men, and included elements of all arms, though primarily infantry. They were therefore essentially small armies or corps, and were treated as such, with each commander given the freedom to run the camp as they saw fit, though of course there were still guidelines and standards that they had to achieve. The basic organisation of the Channel camps revolved around the ethos of self-contained independence of the army corps. Each camp was garrisoned by a corps under its commander, usually a marshal, but in any case always an experienced, trusted general. Broers further explains that the key to this setup and what would lay the foundation for the success to come was the trust shown by Napoleon towards not only the generals but also the troops themselves. Whereas he distrusted his admirals, Napoleon showed immense faith not only in his senior commanders, the marshals, but in their subordinates, and in his elite troops, the Imperial Guard, the Grenadier divisions, and increasingly, the specialist heavy cavalry and artillery arms. While hardly standing aside from detailed matters, he still gave them far greater latitude in how they carried out his orders. His many missives to his commanders in the Channel camps are largely free of the obsessive harping on the particular that characterized his dealings with the Navy. For those who have followed this series thus far, this trust and independence should come as no surprise, because decentralization of command was a theme throughout the Grande Armée, and it became a hallmark of their ability to adapt and overcome problems faced on the battlefield, in turn enabling them to then outmaneuver and outwit their opponents. Of course, for this to become a possibility, the troops themselves needed to be well trained, well organized, and possess a trust and understanding with their commanders. Fortunately, the camps themselves provided the perfect environment for all of this to take place. Even though a large part of the troops there were veterans, they began with a month of refresher training in the schools of the soldier and of the company. Then came 2 days of battalion and 3 days of division drills every week. On Sunday, the entire corps drilled, infantry, cavalry and artillery together. That training well absorbed, there were large-scale manoeuvres twice a month. The battalion exercises mentioned above would consist of familiarizing the soldiers with the manoeuvres and formations as highlighted in the first 3 parts of this series. The men would also be trained in the proficiency of their individual arms, be it musket, horse, sword or cannon. However, the greatest benefit of the camps was the opportunity for the different arms to work in unison, building a mutual understanding and trust. During the months at Bologna, infantry, cavalry and artillery arms within each corps had trained more closely together than ever before, with the result that the First Grand Army of 1805 was probably the best trained force Napoleon ever commanded. Upon the battlefield, and in a grand tactical sense, this cooperation between the arms creates what is known as combined arms tactics. Although warfare of the period was not the rock-paper-scissors game between infantry, cavalry and artillery that some historians attempt to make it out to be, there was still an element of each arm having various strengths and weaknesses in comparison to the others. The aim of combined arms tactics, therefore, was to attempt to nullify these weaknesses while simultaneously placing the enemy into an uncomfortable position of being torn between multiple decisions. This, I think, is easier to explain with a quick example. Imagine if a defending infantry unit was approached by enemy cavalry. Ideally, the infantry would want to form square and hold its fire to ensure its safety and to deter the cavalry. If they were approached by infantry, they would instead want to form line, trade volleys with the enemy, and potentially break ranks in order to charge with the bayonet. However, if they were approached by both cavalry and infantry simultaneously, then a defending infantry was now placed into a dilemma. Forming square would certainly protect it from the cavalry, but doing so would make it vulnerable to the infantry. If they decided to form line, then trading volleys or attempting to charge would leave them vulnerable to the cavalry. The point is that there is no correct way of approaching this situation, as Nafziger explains. The trick of combined arms attack was to force the enemy into choosing between two bad situations. Having obliged the defending force to assume a hopeless situation, the small-scale action was won before the first shot was fired. The combined arms attack was the ultimate weapon of its day. It combined the best of each arm and blended it so as to synergize the individual arms' ability into something that was far more capable than the sum of the individual arms might otherwise be expected to be. It had its weaknesses and could fail if the timing was mishandled, but if properly exercised, it was invariably victorious. As mentioned in that final line, the timing of these sorts of maneuvers was crucial, as was the spacing between units to allow each arm the room to deploy and flourish in their role. Essentially, the word to sum this up would be coordination, and 2 years spent practicing these sorts of things made the French troops and officers extremely proficient at it. Unfortunately, describing or showing what these grand tactical maneuvers and formations actually look like is where things get a little trickier. The reason for this is simply because grand tactics are usually entirely situational and fully dependent upon too many factors such as the terrain, the enemy's movement or positions, the quality of the troops, the makeup of the army. The list could be endless. Good generals were therefore those who possessed a coup d'œil and could at a glance assess both the terrain and the situation, and then form up and utilize their units in the optimal manner. An example of this was shown in the short video that I did on mixed order. Mixed order is usually shown in history books as this, but in reality it was a term used to describe any number of formations that included a combination of different formations and/or arms. At Austerlitz, for example, we have 3 different variations described. The first, prescribed by Napoleon, was an effort to counter the masses of Cossacks that he believed the Russians would use during the battle. Sultan and his subordinates then adapted the formation according to the factors on the day as well as their own personal preferences. There are countless other examples of mixed order throughout the Napoleonic Wars, MacDonald's giant hollow square at Wagram being one of those that was an improvisation to account for the circumstances of the moment. The best we can do then is to describe the basic foundation of what the various grand tactical formations would have been loosely based upon, and for this the historian Elting provides us with an apt description. The Grand Army's usual formation during its wars was 2 lines of battalion columns at deployment intervals with enough space between them to allow them to deploy into line, arranged in a checkerboard fashion so that the columns of the second line covered the gaps between those of the first. This loose, flexible formation was the skeleton of the Grand Army's battle array. Artillery and cavalry could advance or retire through the gaps between the battalions. Reserves of all arms would be massed further to the rear to be committed as the battle ripened. Essentially, the key point is the importance of spacing and flexibility. The infantry must have enough room to deploy whilst mutually supporting their neighbour, yet also allow enough space for the artillery and cavalry to manoeuvre as well. Beyond this basic principle, the various adaptations and adjustments to the formations could, and often would be, endless. This lack of regular or formalized grand tactics does not mean that the training done in the camps was therefore pointless, because it was in fact quite the opposite. Although I have so far been unable to find any real descriptions of the types of maneuvers or operations that were practiced, if we refer to the French camp at Vosseau that took place in 1778, of which we do have details, we can probably get an indication of what sorts of things would have taken place around Bologna. Although occurring under the Ancien regime, this was also during a period of intense military debate in France, and the Vosseau camp was therefore set up to essentially test out the various methods being proposed by different military theorists. What took place was a wide range of grand tactical operations, where the army was split in half and placed into made-up scenarios, each presenting situations that might be encountered during times of war. For example, one side could be defending a village whilst the other attacks, or perhaps both sides engage in a chance encounter by deploying straight from their orders of march, or one side could stage a river crossing, etc., etc. Once given the scenario, the generals then devised various methods of tackling it, utilizing different formations, alternate methods of marching, all sorts of things. The soldiers would then perform these maneuvers, and although of course no live fire was actually used, the results would then be analysed and debated, with the scenarios often being repeated but with new ideas and potential fixes implemented to judge their impact. It is therefore not difficult to imagine that similar events would have taken place at the coastal camps, where different formations, methods of attacking and defending, the timing of manoeuvres, etc., all would have been tested in numerous different scenarios, ranging from divisional exercises all the way up to corps and army-level grand manoeuvres. During this period, we find that Marshal Ney, commanding the Montreal camp, put together a set of primarily infantry instructions, no doubt inspired by the variety of scenarios and formations that he would have been testing, alongside the combat experience that he already had. Whilst not all future marshals wrote instructions, the training at their own camps enabled them to develop preferences which we do see come out during the campaigns to come. For example, Soult tended to prefer manoeuvring in columns, whereas Lannes held more of a preference for line. It wasn't just the senior officers that benefited from this extended series of tests, but also the junior officers and the troops themselves, who would have fully understood their roles and responsibilities within these various manoeuvres. Whilst training can never truly ready the men for live combat, enough practice does instill confidence in the soldier, his comrades, and most importantly in his officers. It is of little wonder that many of the Russians present during the Battle of Austerlitz commented on how the French manoeuvred under fire as if on parade. It was practically second nature to them at this point, and the only new factor, as scary as it would have been, was the enemy's fire. Although it may be difficult to reduce grand tactics to a series of diagrams or animations, we can look at a few examples to see how efficiently La Grande Armée operated and utilized combined arms tactics. The first example took place on the northern sector of the Austerlitz battlefield and highlights the ease at which the infantry was able to swiftly change formation in order to support the cavalry. Seeing the Russian cavalry closing on his division, Kellerman gave the order to retire. For a moment it appeared Kellerman was about to be crushed between the onrushing lancers and the solid wall of French infantry, but as the retreating horsemen approached Caffarelli's division, they opened up their intervals as coolly as if they had been on a parade ground. Immediately Kellerman's cavalry passed through, they closed up again and opened fire on the enemy. This close-range fire also included canister from several well-placed cannon, and it inflicted around 400 casualties on the Russian horsemen, forcing them to retire and allowing the French cavalry to reform and attack once again. The cavalry action in this sector was in fact at times chaotic, with both sides going back and forth, but in the end it was the French who were able to come out on top, not only because of their own ability, but also because of the coordination and support offered by the other two arms. Regiments attacked, fell back, regrouped and charged again, but as Ermolov observed, in our cavalry, as in the rest of the army, the majority of actions were uncoordinated without any consideration of support. On the French side, the attacks were far more unified, with cavalry, infantry and artillery all working in support of one another. A similar example of this coordination was shown in the previous video, but it is worth showing again. It took place at the Battle of Friedland, during the commencement of what would prove to be the decisive attack by Ney's Sixth Corps. As the infantry advanced and began to pressure their Russian counterparts, enemy artillery and cavalry threatened to halt their progress. Almost instinctively, the French gunners and cavalry sprang to life to assist their colleagues, with the artillery silencing the troublesome enemy battery, whilst the cavalry saw off those of the enemy who were trying to flank the infantry. These forms of coordination didn't require orders from high levels of command, but were instead very often the result of initiative taken by junior officers. In a sense, they were natural occurrences and reactions, programmed by relentless training and as a consequence of the new corps system that enabled and encouraged this mutual support between the three arms. Although it may seem as if each coastal camp simply transitioned into a Grande Armée when the army began its march towards the Rhine in 1805, this was not totally the case. In fact, by this point, several of the camps had moved so that much of the army was stationed in and around Bologna, in preparation for the crossing of the Channel and invasion of England. For a variety of reasons, that event never took place, and when Napoleon instead dictated plans for a potential clash with Austria, the army was split into 7 corps, alongside a cavalry reserve, the Imperial Guard, and the Grand Park or Artillery Reserve. The first of these corps, under the command of Marshal Bernadotte, was comprised of troops which had actually taken no part in any of the coastal camps. They were instead part of the small army of Hanover, and, leaving behind one of their infantry divisions, as they marched south towards Bavaria in order to join La Grande Armée, they were simply renamed as First Corps. 5 of the other 6 corps were generally based upon their camp organisation and placed under the command of their camp commanders, 4 of whom were now marshals of the empire. Certain minor adjustments and reallocations were made, however, with some troops being left behind to maintain the illusion that the army was still ready to invade England, whilst others were switched between corps to vary their strength. The exception to this was 5th Corps, to be commanded by Marshal Lannes. Lannes, it will be remembered, had taken no part in the coastal camps, instead training the army of Italy alongside Massena. 5th Corps, therefore, comprised of divisions from both Soult and Davout's camps, along with the Grenadier Division, which had been trained by Junot and was now commanded by General Oudinot. The Cavalry Reserve, consisting of 6 cavalry divisions, was of course led by Marshal Murat, whilst the Guard was commanded by Marshal Bessières. Primarily a cavalry leader, in battle Bessières led only the cavalry of the Guard into action, with the infantry and later artillery subordinate to their own commanders, but during campaign and times of peace, Bessières did function and was very much seen as the overall leader of the Guard. The quality of the French leadership has been emphasised in the previous parts on each individual arm, and needless to say, at every level of command, with only a few exceptions, La Grande Armée possessed good commanders, capable and willing to utilise the initiative and flexibility granted to them by this corps system, but they also possessed another factor. A further advantage that the French enjoyed over their enemies was that of the relative youth of the French commanders compared to their enemy counterparts. Whilst youth certainly brings the usual advantages of energy and enthusiasm, as well as a sense of recklessness in the face of danger, all qualities that can aid the soldier, there is also another, often overlooked and more cognitive advantage that youth can offer. Within the realm of tactics and strategy, knowledge and experience are crucial factors. Therefore, theoretically, the old and wise general who has fought many wars should be the most successful, but history tends to suggest otherwise. This, I believe, is because experience can be somewhat of a double-edged sword. In almost all battles and campaigns, mistakes are made by both sides, and the victor is usually the one who either makes the least or is able to capitalize better upon those of their opponent. Therefore, becoming an experienced general will most likely mean having also made plenty of mistakes. When a man has committed no faults in war, he can only have been engaged in it but a short time. These mistakes can then grow into doubts. Doubts then lead to overthinking, and overthinking leads to paralysis and indecision, traits that are completely unacceptable in a soldier, yet alone in an officer. Irresolution in war is the most dangerous defect in a commander, more especially when the enemy is approaching. He must make up his mind without long deliberation. It is often better to come to a bad decision immediately than to hesitate between several good ones, for the bad one has always some favourable side by which success may be attained. It would seem then that there must be an optimal age whereby a person has gathered enough experience to be competent in their craft, but has not yet acquired the doubts and paralysis that can come with age. This cognitive trend can, I believe, be seen in chess, a game based almost exclusively upon mental ability. Again, like with strategy in war, theoretically it should be the older players having the most experience and knowledge who are the best, but if you consult the average ages of chess world champions, you will notice that most of them attain the title in their 20s or early 30s, and yet few retain it beyond the age of 40. Instead, it appears as though players reach their peak in their 20s and then show a decline as they reach their late 30s. Whilst factors such as family life and other distractions off the board may certainly be part of the issue, it does seem that other, more mental factors are at play. During their peak years, a player seems to strike the balance between experience and knowledge. Without any second guessing, they simply play what is objectively in their minds the best move. The experienced player, however, may have played this move hundreds of times and will remember multiple examples of where they believed it to be the best move, but were then proven wrong and it cost them. This may then lead to questioning the move or even their own ability in future games, causing an indecision and confidence crisis that simply lessens their overall ability, hence the decline. Returning to warfare, Napoleon's own career offers a great example of this exact same thing. The campaigns of 1812 onwards are plagued with moments of indecision which simply aren't present in his earlier campaigns. Mistakes can be found in equal measure from Toulon through to Waterloo, but he only stumbles in the later campaigns because it is rarely the actual mistakes that cost him, but the indecision that either leads to them or comes as a result of them. Prime Napoleon simply reacts to the situation at hand, whereas later Napoleon spends too long reflecting and overthinking, giving his opponents either a reprieve or simply handing them the initiative. It is also noteworthy that Napoleon seemingly predicted his own cognitive decline back in 1805. "One only has a certain time for war. I have another 6 years in me, then I shall have to stop." He was 36 years old when he said this, and the average age of the key French commanders coming into the Grande Armée period was not much older, at just under 40. In chess terms, this would probably be towards the end of their prime period, but I think with warfare this prime seems to occur a little later, probably because it takes longer to gain the necessary experience. As a comparison, during the 1806 campaign, the Prussian commanders had an average age of 58.8 compared to the French's 40.5. Given their overall success during this period, it would therefore seem that the French officers were all either in or heading into their prime. Like Napoleon, the decline in their performances comes later, and although often explained away as no longer having anything to prove and having too much to lose, I think that cognitive decline with age played a definite role as well. By October 1813 at Leipzig, this 18-year advantage of the French army and corps commanders over their opponents had dwindled to just 4. But returning to what was clearly the heart of the army, the 7 newly created and organized corps d'armée. Each corps comprised 2 or 3 infantry divisions, a cavalry brigade, later division, divisional artillery, and a corps artillery reserve. Engineer companies and a corps staff were included to make the organization a self-contained unit of 20 to 30,000 men. Although General Moreau's army at Hohenlinden was almost using a corps system, this final implementation by Napoleon contained much more artillery and was generally more well-rounded. In referring to this example of Davout's Third Corps, you can also see that very often attached were auxiliary companies such as sappers, pontiers, and armourers. These, alongside the combination of arms, enabled the corps to operate in almost complete independence, possessing the tools and skills to overcome most obstacles that they might encounter. It will be noted as well that Napoleon had returned cavalry to the structure, although usually this was light cavalry, with the majority of the heavy cavalry and dragoons still retained as part of the cavalry reserve. As the corps grew larger and the cavalry became of divisional strength, one of the brigades could include dragoons, and at certain times, such as during the beginning of the 1809 campaign on the Danube, heavy cavalry divisions could even be attached, but frequently the corps cavalry consignment consisted primarily of light cavalry. The reason for this is that light cavalry was simply the most diverse of the 3 types, and could therefore function in multiple roles in support of the corps. This was discussed in much more detail during part 2 of this series, but essentially both the heavies and the dragoons were specialised as battle cavalry, neither of whom were well suited to reconnaissance work. Light cavalry, on the other hand, were specialized in reconnaissance, but if the corps did become engaged, then they could still function as battle cavalry, providing mounted support until further reinforcements could arrive. The whole concept of the corps was one of delegation and the formation of discrete fighting units, capable of sustaining independent maneuvers and engaging enemy formations alone initially until reinforced. It is a myth that a corps was a wholly self-contained unit, however. Its main constituent was line infantry, with smaller proportions of light infantry units for skirmishing, and light cavalry for reconnaissance and cover, with units of medium and some heavy artillery. Brower's assessment in that final sentence is correct in the sense that, although it contained elements of all three arms, each corps was not an individual army. Whilst they did operate independently, the idea of the system was one of mutual support, with each corps remaining within striking distance of another. If one corps found the main enemy army, then its mission was to pin it in place whilst the other corps marched to the sound of the guns and came to its aid. Ideally, French corps operated on independent axes of advance but within mutual support of another. This allowed Napoleon to coordinate the Grande Armée on campaign with greater ease than his opponents could control their armies. The control and command of these corps was conducted by Napoleon on a strategical level, but to understand his thinking in this area, we must first discuss those who inspired and influenced him. Review repeatedly the campaigns of Alexander, Hannibal, Caesar, Gustavus Adolphus, Turenne, Eugene, and Frederick. Model yourself upon them. This is the only means of acquiring the secret of the art of war. Throughout his life, Napoleon remained a relentless reader, and during his time in the military academies, he often lost himself in the lives and campaigns of those great military commanders quoted above, absorbing their methods and decoding their principles. It is far beyond the realm of this study to delve into the strategical techniques of each of those men, but we will very briefly mention Frederick, who reflected and wrote much on the art of war, and of whom Napoleon was particularly fond. Again, it is beyond my scope to go into the depth it probably deserves, but just simply pulling a few quotes should help to understand how strong Frederick's influence on Napoleon truly was. If you wish to fight the enemy and he appears to be avoiding a scrap, have the word spread that your army is diminished or give every indication that you fear the enemy. Conversely, if you have no inclination to fight, let it be known that you are stronger than you actually are and put up a bold front. Is this not simply Sun Tzu's art of war, when strong appear weak and when weak appear strong? And is the first principle described here by Frederick not the exact approach that Napoleon took in luring the Allied army to fight him at Austerlitz? One method of outfoxing the enemy that cannot be recommended too highly is to be the first to enter on campaign, for in this way you win terrain and often either surprise the enemy or are presented with the opportunity to defeat a detachment in detail. A general must keep a firm resolution to assume the offensive as soon as the occasion presents itself. Again, in reading this quote, I cannot help but think of Napoleon always seeking to seize the initiative and launch an offensive action, even when outnumbered or seemingly on the defensive. Whilst it would be easy to conclude that Napoleon was therefore heavily influenced by Frederick, when reading through the book I am quoting, which is an edit of much of Frederick's writing on the art of war, he makes frequent mention of the great commanders that had gone before him, using their battles and campaigns as examples to prove his various points. Therefore, it would seem that Frederick, like Napoleon, absorbed the works and lives of these men, and through it discovered the art of war. In fact, Frederick's initial description on strategy is very reminiscent of Jomini's art of war. When your strategy is decided and you have accumulated sufficient supplies to put it into effect, then you must devise every conceivable means of concealing your intentions from the enemy so that, when the campaign gets underway, your movement puts him on the wrong scent and induce him to suspect intentions quite different from those you actually have. In other words, once you've identified the decisive points and actions, you must then do everything to deceive your opponent, restricting him from doing the same, thereby ensuring your supremacy at these decisive points. What I am trying to get across here, and hopefully something that has become evident throughout the video, is that the principles that constitute the art of war existed long before either Frederick or Napoleon showcased them. No doubt Caesar studied the campaigns of Hannibal, Scipio, and Alexander, who each in turn most likely studied the campaigns of great generals before them. The weapons and small-scale tactics may change with time, but the principles and strategies that constitute the art of war have always remained the same. Two of the French writers who understood these principles and whose work would have a profound influence upon the developing mind of Napoleon were Guibert and Bourset. The Comte de Guibert's impact upon French military tactics, particularly those regarding the evolutions of the infantry, has been discussed in previous videos, but it was his thoughts upon strategy that would influence Napoleon the most. In keeping with all of his writings, movement remained the element upon which Guibert stressed the most importance, and his methods constantly speak of seeking to outmaneuver an enemy. With armies easier to move and lead, one would abandon routine movements for rapid operations, making great expeditions, forced marches, engaging and winning battles by maneuver. Positions and the defensive would be less frequent and less important. To achieve this desired mobility, it was necessary to break up armies into divisions following the pattern of Broglie. These divisions must be combined in their marches so as to be able to support each other in battle. Although Guibert understood and acknowledged the advantage in mobility that the new divisional system could provide, his strategic sense was still limited to the time of Frederick, meaning that whilst he didn't adhere to a strict order of battle, he still believed in massing one's troops and deploying in preparation for battle. He therefore failed to realize the potential for a division, and later a corps, to engage and delay the enemy long enough for support to arrive, a system which would enable the various components to be spread over a much larger area than Guibert would have done. He did, however, make several other key points that the future emperor certainly picked up on. For example, still stressing movement, Guibert called for an active style of defense, something which Napoleon almost always adhered to, with the campaign of 1814, as well as the battles of Austerlitz, Leipzig and Dresden, as examples that immediately spring to mind. The sublime defensive consists not in always seeking positions and receiving battle, but in making the enemy continually fear the offensive, and for that, manoeuvring, forcing him to do the same, and watching for the moment where some faults divide him, slow him up, lay him open, in order to operate immediately on him offensively. Although Guibert recognized the importance of topography, his style of warfare meant that he was against allowing it to dominate proceedings and devolve into a war of positions. Whilst proper scouting and reconnaissance was always important, enemies who were fixed upon terrain features could, he believed, be turned and their lines of communication threatened both on and off the battlefield by the flexibility that his army and methods now offered. Again, this is a key element of Napoleonic warfare. As this might be the final mention of Guibert in this series, I think it only fair to state that his impact upon the French style of warfare, to which Napoleon would lend his name, cannot be overstated. Napoleon understandably steals much of the limelight and credit for the French success during this period, but it was Guibert who helped to lay many of the foundations for the Grande Armée. Pierre de Bourset was throughout his career a chief of staff, independent command being blocked due to his lowly status, but he was in fact regarded by some as the greatest of all time in this role. It is even suggested that the grand flanking manoeuvre attempted at Rossbach was an idea of his, though of course it was horribly executed. Much of his military writing, composed out of a wealth of experience, simply echoed the principles already stated, such as, "Nothing is, without contradiction, more advantageous in war than diversions, but it is necessary that they be well thought out and prepared in advance. One ought to base the examination of the operations upon obstacles, more or less great, which one has to overcome on the inconveniences or advantages which will result from their success in each branch, and, after having made the most plausible objections, to determine the branch which can lead to the greatest advantages, in employing diversions and all that can most successfully delude one's enemy and convince him that one has decided upon some other choice." This repetition would only have further cemented these concepts into the developing mind of Napoleon, but it would be Bourset's work entitled Principe de la Guerre de Montagne that would have the biggest impact. Although the title of the work suggests that it was only applicable to mountainous warfare, concepts which Napoleon would use as the foundation for the opening moves in both of his Italian campaigns, the general principles of the work could be easily applied to more conventional warfare. Being written before the divisional system was fully established, Bourset still recommended keeping one's forces together in open plains, but due to the nature of mountainous warfare, he states that it was possible and even advantageous to divide one's force up into smaller detachments. Bourset favours therefore the division of the army into a number of columns if at all possible. Advancing in this manner, spread out over a large front, it becomes possible to conceal one's objective more easily from the enemy and perhaps to mislead him as to one's intention. Then, in proportion as one approaches the enemy, the columns are reunited on the decisive point. Reading this in conjunction with the writings of Guibert, one can easily imagine the young Bonaparte's mind whirring with ideas about how to wage a new style of warfare. Of course, given that much of this video has suggested that practically none of the strategic or grand tactical concepts most associated with this period were actually invented by Napoleon, it might be tempting to therefore write him off as somewhat overrated. Although Napoleon was not the inventor of these principles, he had the genius and skill to put them into practice more boldly and ruthlessly than his predecessors. It is not to criticize Napoleon to say that he owed much to his teachers, rather it is to enlarge his genius, for his success was achieved with methods available to any general. I personally agree with both of these statements because, as the last section showed, the basic principles of warfare had been understood for thousands of years, and it is not to lessen Napoleon to acknowledge that he obeyed them in the same way as those great commanders before him. Even the Archduke Charles, a perhaps slightly underrated general and adversary of Napoleon, had understood them. To the one who unites and employs the greatest force in the shortest time at the decisive point belongs victory in war. However, I do also think that there is perhaps an area where Napoleon did revolutionize warfare, but first I want to mention John Elting's somewhat humorous statement about much of what has already been written on that subject. Enough books have been written on Napoleon's system of making war to stock several libraries. At least half of them are a serious misuse of good paper and printer's ink. I don't profess to speak on behalf of Mr. Elting here, but what I take this to mean, and what coincides with my own belief, is that trying to break down Napoleon's methods of warfare into a set number of prearranged tactics or strategies is not exactly possible. Very often in books you will find terms such as central position, maneuver sur la derrière, or battalion carré, flaunted and accompanied by diagrams showcasing how they each supposedly worked. Whilst it is an admirable task to attempt to portray Napoleon's strategical concepts in a way that can be readily understood by the lay reader, I believe that it can also be misleading into the notions of warfare. I think that this comes about because of a misinterpretation of strategy, assuming it to be universally applicable to all fields. If we return to chess, a strategical game all too often compared to warfare, one can see how strategy can be applied. There are, for example, different opening combinations that players can learn, and then, once into the mid-game, a competent player is able to plan multiple moves in advance, perhaps even see force positions or even checkmates. This is because a chessboard never changes, and the pieces of both players are always visible and behave exactly as they are supposed to. In warfare, however, things are different. The landscape and terrain over which a campaign takes place can vary from battle to battle, whilst the notion of fog of war means that neither side ever truly knows exactly the position and strength of their opponents, making predictions difficult and every action always involve an element of risk. Finally, the performance of the units is even variable, dependent upon a multitude of different factors, some of which may be out of the general's control. Therefore, strategy does not have the same meaning in chess as it does in military matters, and it is unironically why Napoleon could be both a military genius and yet a woeful chess player, often resorting to cheating and regularly beaten by Josephine. Being poor at chess didn't mean that he failed to understand strategy, it is rather that strategy has different connotations within the two fields. This is why breaking down Napoleon's tactics into a series of set maneuvers like one can in chess is not really possible. Even Chandler, after offering up explanation for what he deems to be the different strategical maneuvers, accepts that reality is not so clear-cut. It would be erroneous to claim that each campaign held only one of these maneuvers at its base, for Napoleonic warfare was highly complex, an ever-shifting kaleidoscope of moves and intentions which as often as not left the foe completely bewildered. Thus, one strategic maneuver often led into another of a different type. A legitimate question then, given the idea that warfare has so many random and unpredictable factors which prevent preset strategies, is how did Napoleon, and all great commanders for that matter, achieve such consistent results, proving themselves greater than their contemporaries? The answer is that they were master improvisers. On both a grand tactical and strategical level, the great commanders could quickly assess the situation before them and come up with solutions that best utilized the tools that they had at hand, aka the capabilities of their army, all of which was grounded in the principles understood to be the art of war. To give an example, at the Battle of Rossbach, the maneuver that the Prussian army undertook to flank the advancing Allies was not pre-planned, it was a reaction by Frederick to the circumstances of the moment. Despite the pressing danger, by judging the ground and knowing the capabilities of his army, he was able to quickly change his entire front, before then attacking and destroying the Allied army still in column. This ability for a commander to recognize and read situations like this is often described as coup d'oeil, and was mentioned in Part 2 as a vital component of good cavalry commanders. Generals also had to possess this ability, but on a grander scale. They had to judge terrain, time and space, as well as the overall developing situation, all within the glance of an eye. Once the situation was understood, they then had to react quickly, both to seize the initiative and to simply act before things could change once again, because in warfare, a correct decision in one moment could prove disastrous in the next. Napoleon was indeed a master at understanding all of this. In war, Napoleon was an incorrigible improviser. His genius lay both in his overall conception of a campaign and in the recognition and immediate exploitation of his enemy's weak point. Consequently, there was no set pattern to a Napoleonic campaign or battle. To Napoleon, war was both the ultimate art and the sublimation of plain common sense. His knowledge of its waging was both cerebral and visceral. When logic misled him, as at Aspern and Landshut-Eckmühl in 1809, his gut instinct that something was wrong could rescue him. He knew the rules of warfare, those basic facts of existence that we now call the principles of war, as few men have known them before or since. He could also sense when it would be wise to throw the book away and follow his own inspiration rather than the rules. The use of the phrase common sense is a good way of describing warfare because essentially, at its heart, war is simple. Even the art of war in its description is simple enough. Achieve supremacy at the key points. In war, everything is simple. Only the simplest thing is very difficult to achieve. Clausewitz is right, and it speaks again to the definition of genius, the notion of making the complex appear simple. Anyone can put paint on canvas, but few can do it in the manner that Michelangelo did. Therefore, just like any great artist must be well versed in the principles and techniques of his craft before he can create masterpieces, so too must a general have a thorough understanding in both the principles and art of war. As we have seen, Napoleon had this thanks to his incessant reading and understanding of the great commanders and military writers that went before him. These principles became so natural to the emperor that Elting is right in referring to them as common sense and gut instinct in the prior quote. It is also why Napoleon felt able to make this rather cheeky statement. I have fought 60 battles and learnt nothing from the last that I did not know from the first. Many usually dismiss this comment outright as arrogance, but there is perhaps an element of truth to it, because clearly from the very start Napoleon showed a comprehensive understanding of the principles of war, and considering that these hadn't fundamentally changed in over 2,000 years, it was unlikely that they therefore changed between his first and final battles. However, something I believe that Napoleon did alter was the style of warfare, and it compelled those poor Austrian commanders exposed to it during his first Italian campaign to declare that he makes war like a madman. At the start of the video, we discussed the different definitions for grand tactics and strategy, the first being what took place upon the battlefield, and the latter being events upon the map, but then stressed that they are always linked and dependent upon one another, as Moore explains. In a set-piece battle, the general had usually done his most important work by the time the first shot was fired. The days or weeks of the campaign preceding the action determined its circumstances, which commander had managed to concentrate the greater force, whether one was able to fight on a battlefield of his choosing, or if one army had been unsettled by being forced to retreat. Wide turning movements may have been initiated which could bear fruit during the battle, or troops might have been detached too far to rejoin in time to take part in the fighting. Prior to this period, the rules, if war could ever be described as having any, were to essentially wargame first on the map, moving troops around in order to gain advantages. Then, with the armies in place, the battle would occur, before events then returned to the map for the next phase of strategic play. This simplistic description downplays too much of warfare, and it was rarely as clean-cut as this, but essentially due to strict orders of battle and single-entity armies, this was not too far from reality. Napoleon, however, in no small thanks to the divisional and corps systems at his disposal, took things a step further. Chandler recognises and rather aptly names this as the strategic battle, and although he states that the emperor only used it a few times, I believe that it was the core concept behind Napoleon's entire notion of war. Essentially, this strategic battle is the combining of both strategy and grand tactics into a single action. They are not just related in the emperor's mind, but are one and the same, with no dividing line between them. Napoleon simply saw battles and engagements as a means of strategy, while strategic maneuvers on the map could equally form parts of the grand tactics that turned battles. It is often in the system of campaign that one conceives the system of battle. To better explain this, we will use the following example. Let us imagine that the emperor has no knowledge of the location of the enemy, but has spread his corps out as follows, each within supporting distance of another, but covering enough ground so as to prevent the enemy from slipping by. If Corps B bumps into the enemy or is attacked, then it will immediately either attack the enemy to pin it, or fight a strong defensive action to keep them engaged. Napoleon then has multiple options. The other three corps could all march directly towards the battle in order to lend support, or, if Napoleon deemed that Corps B could hold on with minimal support, then he could order one or both of Corps A and C to keep marching and therefore fall upon the enemy's rear and line of communication. If, on the other hand, Corps C was attacked, then a similar situation could take place, and the other three corps could be ordered to pivot on Corps C in an attempt to turn the enemy, or perhaps just A and D whilst B moves to support. Some people may be tempted to comment that what I'm describing is just the bataillon carré, but it both is and isn't. It is in the sense that the bataillon carré is a form of strategic battle, but it isn't in the sense that the grand formation known as the bataillon carré was simply a result of Napoleon's way of warfare. It was most famously used during the 1806 campaign, and not knowing the location of the Prussian army, nor their schemes, Napoleon simply organised his army in a compact formation, ready to react to however events unfolded. Once the campaign began and the Prussians' plan became slightly more clear, Napoleon in fact broke up the formation and spread his corps out in a wider net to cover all possible eventualities. This is why Davout ends up facing the main Prussian army alone at Auerstadt. Well, that and Bernadotte ignoring both his orders and the basic principles of being a corps commander. The other thing to point out is that whilst our example looks nice and symmetrical here, in reality, the nature of terrain meant that the corps were usually positioned in a much less harmonious fashion. Looking at a few campaign maps, you can see just how spread out the corps could become, though one thing that Napoleon does appear to do is that whilst all corps are theoretically within about 48 hours march distance of the furthest, he generally has them act upon the map in pairs, which is why Bernadotte's inactivity during Auerstadt was so criminal. Therefore, if we alter our own example to better resemble reality, you can now see how the situation and available options has changed. If Corps B finds the enemy now, then due to the distance, trying to flank and cut lines of communication is both difficult and time-consuming, and, depending upon the enemy's strength, possibly too dangerous. Therefore, if given a scenario like this, Napoleon would most likely simply have all corps march straight to the battlefield and conduct proceedings as a standard engagement, which is exactly what happened at Friedland in 1807. However, if Corps D is the one that first encounters the enemy, then you can see how natural it is now for both B and C to fall on the flank or rear of the enemy, whilst A simply acts as support. You can also recognise that, thanks to fog of war, it is rarely possible to predict which of these actions the enemy might take, which is why improvisation is such a key element of command. During campaigns, therefore, Napoleon, using whatever knowledge he had of the enemy location and strength, would move his corps so as to try and manipulate scenarios where he could turn the enemy positions, but the very nature of fog of war, along with dozens of other factors, meant that this wasn't always possible. The reality of this unpredictability is also why I suspect that Chandler and many others don't believe Napoleon to be always using this system, because he isn't able to pull off, or at least attempt to pull off, large strategical flanking maneuvers in every battle. The assumption is that he wasn't attempting the strategic battle this time around. The truth is usually that in those scenarios, such a maneuver simply wasn't feasible. To discuss this way of war using a few examples, a great early one was the Battle of Castellone in 1796. Studying the disposition of both the enemy and his own troops, Napoleon recognized a glorious opportunity to set a trap. However, it would require a little finesse. Seeing on his maps that one of his divisions, Fiorella's, was approaching the battlefield from the south, Napoleon devised for both Massena and Augereau to attack the Austrians to their front before then feinting a retreat, the idea being to tempt the Austrians into following and thus exposing their rear to Fiorella's force. It was a brilliant concept, one which initially worked with the Austrians taking the bait and extending themselves in pursuit of the retreating French, but unfortunately Fiorella's timing was off and his flanking force arrived prematurely. The Austrians, sensing the danger and now recognizing the trap, were able to pull back and retreat, leaving Napoleon overall dissatisfied. Despite this, Castellone does show how early he understood and was utilizing this concept of warfare. This failure also shows that fighting war in this manner would require skilled, competent and trustworthy commanders, which hopefully, as this series has shown, is exactly what Le Grande Armée possessed. Corps commanders were given an independence with which they were entrusted to show initiative and an understanding of Napoleon's concepts, which during our period they often did. At Friedland in 1807, Lannes was able to fight a skillful defensive battle, fixing the main Russian army and buying time for several more corps to arrive and then defeat the enemy. The best example of this entire system in action, however, is of course at Austerlitz in 1805. Conceiving of the idea of weakening his right flank in order to lure the Allies into that area, before then launching his own counter-offensive in the centre, Napoleon entrusted fully to both the corps system and his way of warfare. Firstly, to prevent his right from totally collapsing, he relied upon Davout's ability to march his corps quickly enough from Vienna in order to reinforce that sector mid-battle. The fighting on the opposite flank, in the north, was entrusted to both Lannes and Murat, using their corps and the reserve cavalry respectively. Although Napoleon never lost sight of either flank, his trust in both the corps and their commanders enabled his focus to be primarily in the centre, where the decisive point would ultimately prove to be. None of this should take away from Napoleon's prowess on the battlefield either. Just focusing on these latter two battles, his attack on the Pratzen Heights at Austerlitz was timed perfectly, as was his judgment to restart the Battle of Friedland at 5 p.m. rather than waiting for more reinforcements as many of his commanders felt necessary. Often overlooked because it ended as a draw and was probably the low point for this great army, the Battle of Eylau nonetheless showcased Napoleon's grand tactical understanding and how he could react when his strategical battle system wasn't going entirely to plan. Meeting the Russians around the town of Eylau, Napoleon's initial conception for the battle was not too far away from our own simplistic example. He had only 2 corps, his guard and the reserve cavalry with him at the start of the battle, but due to the positions of both Ney's 6th and Davout's 3rd Corps, he had ordered them to march so as to fall on the flank of the enemy, a classic pincer move. At daybreak, when the Russian artillery bombardment began, there was as yet no sign of either flanking force. Realizing that he was much weaker than his opponent, Napoleon flexed so as to appear stronger than he really was, launching Soult's corps forward to pin the Russians. Unfortunately, they were badly mauled, and fearing that a counterattack in that sector could easily roll up his army, the Emperor ordered Augereau's corps forward, along with Saint-Hilaire's division, the idea being that they would link up with Davout once he eventually arrived in that sector. Once again, however, fate played her hand, and stumbling the wrong way through a snowstorm, Augereau's brave men found themselves directly in front of the enemy Grand Battery, and also under fire from their own guns, who couldn't see them due to the weather. Predictably, they quickly broke with the jubilant Russians in hot pursuit. Perhaps most generals would have at this point called off the battle, began a fighting withdrawal and salvaged what they could of the army, but not Napoleon. Ever the gambler, and sensing an opening, he coolly ordered Murat to take the entire reserve cavalry forward to crush the enemy counterattack and to then break their centre. This they did, some of the divisions trotting nearly 2,500 yards in the snow before finally losing momentum and having to turn back, once again having to fight their way through the reforming Russian lines. Had the French more men, then this gallant charge would probably have won the day, but as it was, it merely won time enough to stabilise the front and for Davout's corps to finally arrive and begin to push back the Russian flank. By mid-afternoon, things were finally starting to look up for the French, but then Lestocq's Prussian corps, supposed to be blocked by either Ney or Bernadotte, arrived to restore the odds and push Davout back once more. By the time Ney did arrive on the left, it was too late to do anything but ensure a stalemate, though the delay was no fault of Ney's, it must be said. Had he arrived sooner, however, then perhaps the envisioned pincer move would have come off, and Eylau would have been remembered as a glorious French victory and a showcase of Napoleon's genius at full capacity. As it was, the blood-stained snow merely marked an indecisive and tragic waste of life. La Grande Armée may have been blunted by the stubborn Russian bear, but Napoleon had shown once again his brilliance in both grand tactics and as a master improviser, even when his way of war failed him. Discussions regarding both grand tactics and strategy can be difficult to navigate. Whilst they can have separate definitions, it is clear that both are heavily influenced by multiple and varying factors, such as terrain, fog of war, capabilities of the army, as well as each other. This makes breaking them down into set patterns or maneuvers both difficult and honestly very misleading. The great commanders certainly had plans going into their campaigns and battles, but again, each would be unique and dependent upon all of the above factors. It is very different planning a campaign in the mountains to one in the plains, for example. However, even the most ingenious of plans can hardly ever account for the actions of the enemy, which is why no plan survives first contact. To quote General Eisenhower, "Plans are useless, but planning is everything." The great commanders, from Alexander to Frederick, were therefore master improvisers, able to use their foundation in the principles of war to both read and then react to the cascading situations on and off the battlefield. Napoleon was no different, and was as well versed in the art of war as any military genius before him, but what he also had was a unique advantage to help him shape a new way of warfare. Prior to his rise, several European nations during the mid to late 18th century had begun to explore methods of dividing their armies up into smaller, more maneuverable parts. The French were to take this the furthest, initially creating the divisional system, but during the Revolutionary Wars, this then evolved into the combined arms combat divisions. As these wars continued, generals such as Hoche, Monroe, and Bonaparte tweaked and morphed this system until, in the training camps around Bologna, Napoleon was able to establish the corps system. Each corps, whilst not simply a small army, was nonetheless an individual element, capable of supporting itself and forcing engagements upon the enemy, allowing other corps time to march in and provide support. Unfortunately, as the early revolutionary generals showed, coordinating such elements was not always easy, and could too often result in unconnected and uncoordinated actions. Napoleon, however, was no ordinary general. Well versed in the principles and the art of warfare, and having absorbed the teachings of Guibert and Bourset, he began to conduct his forces in ways not yet seen. Given their independence, corps could now arrive mid-battle and engage directly from their orders of march. This enabled Napoleon to combine both strategy and grand tactics into what Chandler coins the strategic battle, a morphing of warfare into one continuous motion, one which saw him confound his opponents and lead La Grande Armée to such dominance. However, even with this ability and his principles firmly in place, no two battles or campaigns were ever the same. Therefore, the best way to understand the specific strategies and tactics of Napoleon is to study his campaigns in depth, to examine the decisions that he made and to try to determine what the purpose behind them was. Obviously that is too much for this video, but hopefully as the channel grows it will be something we can get into and discuss in detail. But until then, and until next time, thanks for watching.